The cabin lights dimmed in stages as Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 settled into the overnight cruise. The seatbelt signs clicked off. A flight attendant moved down the aisle with practiced quiet, collecting a tray here, straightening a blanket there. People shifted into the long-haul positions they'd rehearsed for years, headphones on, knees tucked, heads leaning against windows that showed nothing but black ocean and occasional cloud. Flight MH370 had departed Kuala Lumpur just after 12:40 a.m. local time on March 8, 2014, bound for Beijing with 239 people on board, 227 passengers and 12 crew. It was a Boeing 777 on a route flown so often it felt routine. The cabin carried the familiar mix of any late-night international flight. Families returning home, business travelers thinking ahead to meetings, students flying back to school, and grandparents traveling to see relatives. Before boarding, people sent quick notes that were never meant to be last. Taking off now, landing in the morning, I'll call when we get in. Some were nothing more than a heart emoji, a promise, a simple good night. Up front, air traffic control initiated the normal handoff as the jet approached the boundary between Malaysian and Vietnamese airspace. At 1:19 a.m., a calm voice from the cockpit responded with a routine sign-off. "Good night, Malaysian 370. Those were the last confirmed words received from the aircraft. 2 minutes later, the transponder stopped transmitting, and the plane's identity dropped off civilian radar screens. There was no Mayday call, no emergency code, no cockpit warning to the outside world that anything had gone wrong. In Beijing, families arrived at the airport expecting breakfast-time reunions. They watched the arrivals board and the hallway where passengers should have emerged. They stood with winter coats draped over their arms and phones ready to capture the first tired smile under fluorescent light. When the scheduled arrival time passed, airline staff initially spoke in careful, non-committal language about delays and checks. People refreshed their screens and tried calling again. A ringing phone that didn't go to voicemail felt like hope. A phone that rang and then stopped felt like something else. By late morning and into the afternoon, the word missing became unavoidable. At Kuala Lumpur International Airport, relatives gathered in tight knots, staring at officials and translators for any detail that might make the situation comprehensible. In Beijing, families were guided into meeting rooms where updates came in fragments. Contact had been lost, search aircraft had been launched, nothing else was certain. The uncertainty had a physical effect. Some people paced until their legs shook. Others sat so still it looked like they were trying to hold their loved ones in place by sheer force of will. Every new announcement turned into a desperate math problem. How long can a plane fly? How far can it go? Where could it be? Search operations began over the South China Sea. Then the focus shifted as new information emerged. Malaysian military radar indicated the aircraft had deviated from its planned path, turned back across the Malay Peninsula, and headed out over the Andaman Sea. Later, investigators leaned heavily on satellite communications data, automatic signals exchanged between the aircraft and an Inmarsat satellite network that suggested the plane continued flying for hours after it vanished from civilian radar. There was still no distress signal and no clear explanation for the silence, only the growing sense that what happened had happened without witnesses. For relatives, the idea that the aircraft kept flying mattered. A plane still in the air meant options, and options meant hope. Hope looked like phones kept charged at all times. It looked like relatives sleeping in airport chairs with passports in their pockets, ready to board the first flight to anywhere. It looked like arguments over rumors, sightings, alleged landings, hijacking stories, because any explanation felt better than a blank wall. Every time officials gave a briefing, families listened for one sentence that would turn the missing into found. Then came the moment that reshaped everything. On March 24, 2014, Malaysia's Prime Minister announced that new analysis of satellite data indicated Flight 370 had ended in the southern Indian Ocean, far from any runway and far from any coastline where survivors could wait. Around the same time, many families learned the news not through a face-to-face briefing, but through blunt messages delivered to their phones. The devices that had been lifelines became instruments of shock. Some relatives described reading the words and feeling their bodies go cold, because a text has no voice, no pause, no human softness, just a sentence that detonates in your palm. But even that announcement did not deliver closure, because closure requires something solid: wreckage recovered, a cause explained, a place to mourn. The multinational search expanded across a vast and remote stretch of ocean. Aircraft scanned the surface. Ships crisscrossed grid lines. Sonar mapped the seabed. Months became years. Only small debris fragments were later confirmed to have come from the aircraft, washing ashore thousands of miles away, while the main wreckage stayed hidden in deep water. That is the cruelty at the center of MH370's human story. The world gained a probable ending, but families were forced to live without the details that allow grief to settle. There was no recorded goodbye from the cabin, no final voice heard over the radio after 1:19 a.m., no explanation that could be accepted and placed cleanly on a timeline. Instead, there were ordinary final traces preserved by accident: a boarding pass saved in a wallet, a suitcase packed with gifts that never arrived, a last chat thread that ends mid-conversation because there was nothing else to send. In the quiet that followed, people clung to the smallest facts, because facts were all they had. Years passed, and the questions didn't fade. Families marked birthdays with empty chairs. Parents who had once counted down hours until a flight landed began counting years without answers. Investigators could confirm key facts. Communications were disabled, the aircraft was diverted, it flew on for hours, and it most likely ended in the southern Indian Ocean. But they could not say who was responsible or why. Theories multiplied because people cannot live with a void forever. Yet theories are not the same as certainty, and certainty is what the families needed to stop waking up into the same unanswered morning. Flight 370 didn't just vanish from radar. It vanished from the normal rules people rely on to make sense of loss. When someone dies, there is usually a body, a certificate, a funeral, a last place on Earth where they can be named and remembered. With MH370, relatives were asked to accept absence as evidence and distance as a grave. Even when debris appeared, it arrived as isolated fragments, confirmation without explanation, leaving the same unanswered question hovering over every family photo and every last message saved on a phone. What happened after goodnight? Thank you for listening to The Lantern's Tale. Subscribe for more true stories, if you dare.